下面有请 GSV Ventures 管理合伙人 Deborah Quazzo、津巴布韦第一任教育和文化部部长 Dzingai Mutumbuka、中国发展研究基金会秘书长方静。Let's welcome the Managing Director of GSV Ventures, Deborah Quazzo, the first Zimbabwe Minister of Education and Culture, Dzingai Mutumbuka, the Secretary General of the China Development Research Foundation, Fang Jing.
Well, good morning. It is a delight to be here at GES, and it's really my tremendous pleasure to have two incredibly accomplished men on stage with me today to discuss really the critical role of education in creating social and economic mobility and in eradicating poverty in both emerging countries and actually in all countries. Dzingai Mutumbuka, did I get that right? Was Zimbabwe's first Minister of Education and Culture from 1980 to 1988, when he literally served in the organization of that emerging country post-independence. He was also a member of parliament. He went on to serve in senior management positions in education at the World Bank, including acting as sector manager for human development for Eastern and Southern Africa. He has consulted to the World Bank, to UNICEF, and to many African education ministers. Today, he serves as a member of UNESCO's governing board of the International Institute for Educational Planning. This is his so-called retirement. I hear his wife has to say a lot about that. He is very busy. Fang Jin is Secretary General of the China Development Research Foundation, one of the hosts of GES, which speaks volumes about how important the advances in education are to China and its citizens. Fang's key area of research is China's economic relations with the outside world. He has written extensively on China's foreign economic policy, globalization, and the world economy. He co-authored the book, A Trap or a Wall, The Real Challenges and Strategies Facing the Chinese Economy, which won China's most prestigious award for economic research in 2012. So you can see I have two highly accomplished individuals here. So, gentlemen, where I'd really like to start is the topic of equity, and equity in education. We talked a little about this yesterday. The importance of making the absolute highest quality of education available to all citizens, not just the upper tier, if we can hope to eradicate poverty and create social mobility. Dzingai, you spoke eloquently yesterday about the importance of delivering the highest quality education. You also noted the importance of not leaving women and girls behind. I'm sure that also goes for the most deeply impoverished across Africa. I'd love you to talk about the challenges and opportunities. And Fang, I think China, just to speak quickly, then I'll stop talking, let both of you speak, but China obviously is a massive country that has seen absolutely unprecedented growth in its middle class. I'd love for you to speak to the role of education in that, and then also as the country hones in its focus on the rural populations and making sure equitable education is provided there as well, I think that becomes a critical piece of this equity question. So, would you like to start, Mr. Dzingai?
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here in China. I was last here about 30 years ago, and I could hardly recognize the country. Well, let me start with a quotation, or a couple of quotations. The first is from probably the most famous African leader of the last century, Nelson Mandela. Mandela said that education is the most powerful weapon with which you can change society. The second quotation is from Harry Patrinos, an economist at the World Bank, who has studied the returns on education. His latest research demonstrates that investments in education has higher returns than even the stock market. That's quite a profound statement to make. But he goes on to say there are three conditions that are important for the returns to be realized. The first is that you have to start early, meaning early childhood education and development is key. Starting early is key, and we heard this time and again yesterday. Second, you must focus on ensuring that women have a chance for an education. And the third condition is that quality matters. Now, I want to cast this in the context of the difference between the China I visited 30 years ago, the Africa of today, and the China of today. As many of you know, 30 years ago, China was a very different place. But because of the foresight and wisdom of the leadership of this country, I remember in 1981 meeting with your former leader, Deng Xiaoping, when I was accompanying Mugabe here. And he made a very profound statement. He said that when they are finished with the reforms that they were implementing, nobody would recognize China again. That is really wisdom at its best. Unfortunately, if you look at Africa, the projections are that by 2055, Africa will have the largest number of young people in the world. We know that many Asian countries, including China, exploited the youth dividends to the maximum, with the result that they were able to massively reduce poverty. I fear that in Africa, unless we are able to provide quality education, relevant education, we are going to end up not with a youth dividend, but with a nightmare. Today, the biggest challenge confronting Africans is youth unemployment, poor education, misery. So what do we need in Africa? What we need in Africa is a Deng Xiaoping who can lead us like he led China to the promised land.
Are you optimistic on that?
Yes and no. Last week I was in a village in Ethiopia. And if I contrast with what I see here or heard yesterday about artificial intelligence, virtual reality, 5G, it's a joke because I'm in this village and 75% of the people cannot read and write, and half of the children are not going to school. That's a sad picture. On the other hand, there are lots of young people today in Africa, including those who have studied abroad, who are coming back and willing to provide leadership so that African children can get the education and the training that they need to lead productive lives. So in a sense, I am optimistic.
Thank you, Deborah and Dzingai. It's a great pleasure to be talking about this very, very important subject, economic development, poverty reduction, and education, the role of education. No doubt, I think China has been the most successful story over the last 40 years in reducing poverty. I mean, China was as poor as many African countries 40 years ago. But first and foremost, China adopted market liberalization, invited foreign investment, and promoting private initiative, which the result is a double-digit growth for nearly 3 decades. I think that explains actually the bulk of poverty reduction in China. And on top of that, China established a social safety net, providing insurance for the retirees, for the sick, and for basic income support. And then in recent years, China, and of course China has always placed great emphasis on the role of education in both economic and social development and the welfare of the citizens. When China was poor, when the Communist Party first came into power 70 years ago, the government launched the literacy campaign. So the majority of the Chinese population were literate as a result of that campaign. But education is still a very, very, a costly venture. It must be compatible with your level of development. So despite the government effort and emphasis on education, by 1982, the average years of education for Chinese citizens still was only 4.5 years in 1982. But now, of course, China has developed. China got much more wealthier, and the government has more resources to spend on education. So we universalized compulsory education, 9-year compulsory education in 1990s. And in late 90s, we adopted an aggressive campaign to expand tertiary education enrollment. So now China enjoys, I think the average schooling for new labor force is 13 years. And for the average citizen is nearly 9 years. So it's a remarkable achievement. I think Chinese now, the government realizes to eliminate poverty for good, we need to invest more in human capital. So on top of economic growth, on top of providing social safety net, we need to invest in human capital, in the health and the education of people. I think Chinese economy has also reached this stage that human capital and knowledge will play a more and more important role in its future economic growth.
It's effectively a competitive weapon.
Yes, that's right.
And the key one for everyone.
Yes.
Yes. Has it, in thinking about a number of companies in the education technology sector, I'm aware, have real initiatives to try to focus on rural communities to deliver higher quality education. Is that part of the supporting broader programs to reach deeper into the population to make sure 100% of communities are have high impact education? Is that?
Yes, of course. Like I said, education, I want to start with a very basic assumption of economic science, which is human wants are unlimited, but resources are limited. So that's why we need economists to figure out what to produce, right, how to produce, and for whom to produce. And now, like I said, I think China has reached this certain stage of development where both the government and private sector have quite adequate resources to invest in human capital, and human capital is important for China's long-term economic and social development. Then the question is where we should spend that actual investment. And of course, according to both economic and social sciences, if you invest in the most vulnerable groups, the most disadvantaged groups in the society, normally you'll get the highest returns because the resources, even though China is much more wealthier than before, the resources is still limited compared relative to our needs. So I think the government, especially it's the government's responsibility to invest in the most disadvantaged areas, namely in rural China, in the poverty-stricken areas, which will generate the highest returns. Thus, China, I talked about the school feeding project. We experimented more than 12 years ago. Now it's national policy, but only concentrated in poor rural areas. Nowadays, 33 million students every day enjoy government-provided lunch, through the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Finance. But in cities, school children still, I still pay for my daughter's lunch in cities. Right. So the concentration and the focus on rural development, poverty-stricken areas is top priority for both China's poverty reduction strategy, but also for education investment. Yes.
And I want to hone in on this human capital question. And we talk a lot in the U.S. and actually globally, I think, about the talent wars, because certainly it's limited human resources and you need to get the right people in the right places. Dzingai, we talked a little bit about your work. Clearly, we're seeing in the U.S. teacher shortages. We need leadership in education as much as we do in any other sector. I'd love for you all to talk about, you've done a lot of work around providing leadership training, leadership guidance, coaching to ministers of education in Africa, in hoping to create a real leadership paradigm for people to go out and spread. Also love to more broadly hear about the talent wars and how they're impacting teacher supply of high quality teachers here in China and in Africa. So I just would love to hear the bigger what you all think about the bigger question of talent and how we get the right people into leadership positions globally around delivering great high quality education.
That's a great question. Yesterday we heard from UNESCO about challenges of achieving SDG 4. If I look at the situation in Africa, there is absolutely no chance in hell. That is, the present situation is maintained. Any single African country will achieve SDG 4. And it's sad if I look at my own country. When I was Minister of Education, before the World Bank recruited me, people said Zimbabwe had developed the best education system. And it's true, probably. We had a literacy rate of more than 90%. But now, because of economic problems, the education standards are plummeting, which means instead of rising higher, they are going down. If you look at the Capital Development Index of Africa, it is the lowest of any region in the world. It's, I think, 0.40. So we really have a serious crisis in Africa. And I think that while Africa is very rich in biodiversity, in natural resources, and in people, human capital, the human capital is raw. It's not yet being productive. And so what we need really is to think outside the box about how we can educate and train these vast millions of young people so that in turn they can really uplift Africa. What is interesting about China, and I think real Africa should learn from China, is how China, from a very low position, became the factory of the world, literally. And I think that Africa has everything within its possibility to follow China's path. But I think in terms of education, unless we can use technology or some other approach, I simply don't see how, with the current resources at stake, we could actually achieve the MDGs. But more importantly, on the issue of leadership, we really recognize that leadership is the biggest deficit in Africa.
Yep.
Africa is not a poor continent. Africa suffers from what I call a poverty of leadership. So with some colleagues, I'm involved in a program at the University of Harvard called the Ministerial Leadership Program. Basically, we know that ministers are appointed. They are not trained. When I was appointed minister, nobody had trained me how you become a minister. So you come into the office and you're supposed to run with the ball. So what we have started is to have 2 sessions a year with ministers of finance and planning in April, and ministers of education and of health and of youth and gender, et cetera, in June. The idea really is to give them the basics of how you become an efficient leader with good acumen and management skills. We pass them through, they have to define what legacy they want to leave behind when they leave office, whether they leave in 1 year or in 5 years, how they set priorities, how they source funding through negotiations or otherwise, or creating internal efficiency in the use of the resources they already have, and how they implement their programs. And we already see that this program in some countries is beginning to bear fruit, but in others, it's like sucking blood out of a rock, because part of the problem is that the people who have been appointed for other reasons, political reasons, and not necessarily going to be good leaders. So really, the accent here is on leadership. For me, a leader is a visionary. And that's why I think of people like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. I think of Deng Xiaoping, because these are people who could see things that other people could not see. And I think that's what we need in Africa. What we need is really visionary leadership that can see the possibilities instead of seeing all the obstacles.
I think China is somewhat blessed by our history and culture. That education, the value of education is so much cherished because of Confucius' teaching. And of course, it's not just us; it's other East Asian countries under the Confucian influence, have share similar value. So and also I think the cherish or the value of education also instilled this concept of meritocracy in China, especially in its governing system. All in history, all the top officials were selected based on their performance in imperial exams. So we still have this kind of mentality or meritocracy in China today. So that is why even when China was poor, even when public investment in education remains inadequate, the private investment or the demand for education, by families, by individuals, remain high. We talk about this before our dialogue, how the top 10 education companies in the world by market cap are all Chinese, and despite the fact that they only represent a very small market share in China.
That's right.
Because there's huge demand for education, because we have this value. You want to succeed, you want to get ahead, you must have education, and good education. So I think this value system still runs through Chinese society, whether it's in the government or in society. In a local level, the head of education department is the most important job. We have a lot of projects in rural China. But on the other hand, and some speakers, including the previous one this morning, mentioned the public investment in education is never enough. So we need to allow private players, non-government players, to take an active role, to first complement public investment, to increase supply of education to people. And also, I think by nature, private actors, private players are innovative. They're willing to take risky experiments. When they succeed, and I think they will pave the way for public scale up. So I think on the one hand, we need to continue to enhance public investment in education, but on the other hand, I think we need to allow private initiative to flourish in education provision.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue for what was on my mind for the next question. GES is about education innovation and celebrating all kinds of innovation, but technology-enabled innovation in particular. I think it also highlights and celebrates the public-private partnership nature of how that innovation has accelerated, certainly here in China. And it's interesting in talking to Tal and others about the two-teacher system, where they're leveraging through technology, leveraging teachers in different locales with different expertise to make each other advance and better and deliver a better product to students. I'm curious from both of you all, as you think about the talent equation and the need to drive educational outcomes better and better, how you view the role of education technology, what it can do to hopefully drive down costs and increase access and most importantly, improve learning outcomes. China today is the irrefutable leader in education technology innovation. It's the place people now come to copy things and take it back to their home countries. And so I just love to get, and actually there's much interesting work happening in Africa as well, trying to go around the existing system to create innovative educational delivery away, outside of traditional platforms. So I'd be curious for any thoughts you two have on the importance of education technology to continue to scale higher educational outcomes and increase access in each of the locales. Fang, do you want to start, or yeah?
Oh,
I'll check either way.
Well, we heard yesterday that you cannot replace a teacher. The teacher will always be needed in the classroom.
Absolutely.
But we also know that technology can really help teachers to achieve much more, can do many things that teachers cannot do. In the past in Africa, the problem has been that the infrastructure did not exist, and so it was very difficult, particularly because in Africa, the divide between the urban and the rural areas is very stark. Many people don't want to work in rural areas because the conditions are difficult, and as a result, the rural areas are the least well served. But I think with the introduction of 5G and other technologies, solar panels and things like this, I think we can go a long way in addressing some of the problems that we are confronting. But I also think that one of the problems, in my experience with education, I don't know about China's education system, but I certainly know about African education systems, is that teachers in general are very conservative. And they are often reluctant to change the way they do business, the way they teach. So we need somehow to find a way of capacitating teachers so that they can adopt technology, appropriate technology, so that they can do more for their students. So for me, teachers lie at the center of everything. If you were to ask me, why was Zimbabwe's education system in the 80s successful, I would say probably because of two things. First, we don't have exactly Confucius values, but we have something similar. Values matter a lot to Zimbabweans. Whether you are at school or at home, values are constantly emphasized. But the second most powerful tool that I was able to use was teachers. Teachers as the agents of change. So you need to be able to recruit the best people, to train them well, to support them while they're at work, and of course to give them incentives for doing their job. So I think that really it's not just technology. Certainly in Africa, a combination of technology and the teachers and the instructional materials is likely to do the trick.
I think, again, China is blessed by our market size. Information technology is increasing in scale using economic jargons. The bigger the market, the higher the return. So because of our, China is the biggest internet market in the world, a lot of the companies are able to develop many new applications, which some of them are world leading. And in this particular, in the area of education, certainly technology, especially information technology, can play a very, very important role in both increasing the access to education, especially by the most disadvantaged groups in society, but also enhancing education quality. For example, I mentioned that China has universalized compulsory education, 9-year compulsory education. No doubt, the enrollment rate for primary education is 100%. But quality of education in many of the, in rural schools, especially in remote villages, the quality is poor, and a lot of classes are not taught because there are not enough qualified teachers, science, sports, arts. But a lot of initiatives taken up by both the public sector and private sector trying to address this problem. Just 2 days ago, I attended an event organized by both TAL and New Oriental. They set up this foundation to use information technology to actually bridge the gap of education quality for rural China, between rural China, between rural areas and urban areas. And they, it's very simple. The idea is very simple, using long-distance learning tools to connect good resource schools in Beijing with village schools, in rural areas. And the result has been remarkable. Some of the students improve their school performance, their like examination marks by like 10 points, 20 points. This is very, very important because it will make the difference whether they go to college or not. And in China, the only metric of success is you pass the college entrance exam, you go to college, and you have a good employment. So the return on this kind of initiative is very, very visible, very, very significant.
Yes. So my final question for you all is this. We discussed this a little bit yesterday about the prioritization of investment, the concept of, you have a pre-K to gray continuum of learning today. It's lifelong learning, and yet limited resources. So you have to focus those resources in the areas of highest return. We actually call that at GSV ROE, or return on education. Can you each speak to the importance, and you told a wonderful Dzingai anecdote yesterday about what you did in Zimbabwe around the early childhood, implementation of change in the early childhood, but can you both speak to the importance of the investment in early childhood and the impact that has upstream, downstream, et cetera, and how critical you view that for the future?
I think part of the reason why education in Africa is so expensive is because many kids repeat classes. And they repeat classes because of a variety of things. But the most important is that the base is very weak. So one of the things I did as Minister of Education was to deploy the best of the best teachers to the early grades. And that really made a huge difference, because by second grade, the students were already able to read and to do basic math. And what I find in many African countries that the source of the problem is that the base is very weak. So I would really emphasize the importance of laying a strong foundation, and that's what I do with all the ministers that I advise in Africa. But I want to end up simply by saying, thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a real, real wonderful experience. And to end up by saying, if the world were able to uplift Africa through human resources development, it's not a zero-sum game. Because as we saw in China, Africa's prosperity is the prosperity of the world, just as China's prosperity has been the prosperity of the world.
So, my foundation step has been promoting, advocating the importance of early child development. I mean, given the limited resources, I think we should spend more resources on early child development, preschool education, parenting services. I'm not saying we shouldn't spend money on other levels of education. As a developing country, we have a huge need, to improve our access and quality for every level of education. But relative to other, levels of education, early child development has been neglected in the past. But I'm very glad that the government has taken notice and recently issued a series of directives aiming to improve and increase investment in this area, in preschool education, in early parenting for children 0 to 3. I think the science from both economics and psychology and neuroscience all show the earlier you invest, the higher the return. And it's also less costly, obviously, than formal education. So I think that's the area we should focus.
Perfect. With that, thank you so much. This has been terrific. I love doing this, so thank you so much.
感谢嘉宾的精彩分享。Thank you to the speakers for the insightful sharing.